Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going deep into Michael Denton's book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis.
Yes, this book.
Published back in 1986.
Yeah.
It really shook things up in the world of evolutionary biology, and we're going to unpack why.
Absolutely. It sparked a lot of debate.
Even if you think you know a lot about evolution,
It challenged a lot of assumptions.
Denton raises questions that might surprise you. So let's rewind a bit and set the stage. Before Darwin came along, what was the prevailing view of the natural world?
Well, imagine a world where everyone believed that species were fixed and unchanging, like perfectly crafted puzzle pieces that never changed shape.
Okay, so each species was created and stayed the same throughout time.
Right, heavily influenced by the biblical account of creation.
But then things started to shift in the early 1800s, right? Especially with new discoveries in geology.
Exactly. Geologists were finding evidence that pointed to a much, much older Earth than anyone had previously imagined.
Way older than the biblical timeline suggested. So this older Earth really threw a wrench in the traditional view.
Oh, absolutely.
Raised all sorts of questions about how life arose and diversified over such vast periods.
It did.
And that's where Charles Darwin enters the picture.
Right, his voyage on the Beagle.
Yeah, the Galapagos Islands.
Especially his observations in the Galapagos Islands played a pivotal role in challenging the fixed species idea.
Okay, remind me about those Galapagos finches. What was so groundbreaking about Darwin's observations?
So picture this: Darwin's exploring these islands, and he notices that different finch species have unique beak shapes, perfectly adapted to their specific food sources. Some have thick beaks for crushing seeds.
Oh, interesting.
Others have slender beaks for probing flowers.
So each island had its own custom-designed finch.
It was like that, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So these variations within species got Darwin thinking, hey, maybe species aren't so fixed after all.
Precisely. He started to question the idea that species were immutable, created in their final forms. He saw these variations as evidence that species could change over time, adapting to their environments.
Okay, so Darwin's journey led him to develop his theory of evolution, which, as we know, revolutionized our understanding of life. But it wasn't a sudden epiphany, right?
Right. It was a gradual process driven by his observations and the changing intellectual climate of his time.
Years of scientific data.
Exactly. A journey of questioning, analyzing, synthesizing.
Okay, so can you break down the core principles of Darwin's theory for us?
So at its core, Darwinian evolution rests on three key concepts: variation, inheritance, and natural selection. Think of it like a giant ongoing lottery. Every individual within a species has slight variations.
Like the different beak shapes.
Exactly.
Like lottery tickets.
Yes, like lottery tickets constantly being shuffled and dealt out.
Okay, so the lottery tickets are the variations. But what determines the winners?
That's where natural selection comes in. The environment acts as the ultimate judge, deciding which tickets are winners and losers. Individuals with variations that give them a survival advantage in their environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on those traits.
So over vast stretches of time, these beneficial variations become more common, eventually leading to the emergence of new species. It's like nature is constantly fine-tuning its creations, favoring those best suited for survival.
Exactly. And here's the real kicker. Darwin proposed that this whole process, this grand evolutionary saga, was driven by natural mechanisms, not by a divine hand shaping every creature.
Wow, talk about a paradigm shift. It completely overturned the traditional view of a divinely created world.
It did.
And placed humanity squarely within the natural order, subject to the same evolutionary forces as any other species.
It was a radical proposition that challenged religious beliefs.
And sparked intense debate, which continues to this day.
Absolutely.
Now, even Darwin himself recognized that his theory wasn't perfect. And Denton seizes upon some of these acknowledged challenges. One of the biggest sticking points is the fossil record.
Right. If we only looked at living species today, Denton argues the idea of evolution might seem outrageous.
Yeah, because the differences between species are so vast.
They are. It's like comparing apples to oranges to pineapples.
Right. It's like looking at a completed puzzle without seeing all the individual pieces that went into it.
If evolution happened gradually, shouldn't the fossil record be teeming with these transitional forms, the missing links that connect one species to another?
Exactly.
Where are they?
Denton points to specific examples where the fossil record seems to come up short. Take the Cambrian explosion, for instance. About 540 million years ago, a dazzling array of complex invertebrate life appears in the fossil record, with no obvious ancestors in older rocks.
It's like they just materialized out of thin air.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon.
What about the angiosperms, the flowering plants? Didn't they also have a sudden debut? They did indeed. Flowering plants seem to pop up abruptly during the Cretaceous period, with no clear transitional forms linking them to earlier plant groups. These sudden appearances, Denton argues, don't quite fit the narrative of slow, gradual evolution.
Now, some scientists argue that the fossil record is simply incomplete. Maybe we just haven't found enough fossils yet to fill in all the gaps.
Denton addresses that counter-argument.
Okay.
He's skeptical that the gaps can be solely attributed to insufficient searching or the imperfections of fossilization. He suggests that these gaps might be real, reflecting a fundamental discontinuity in the history of life.
So Denton is essentially saying, hold on, maybe evolution isn't as smooth and continuous as Darwin proposed.
That's the question he's raising. He's pushing us to consider that the traditional view of evolution might need some adjustments to account for these seemingly abrupt transitions in the fossil record.
Okay, so we've got these gaps in the fossil record. But Denton also tackles another piece of the evolutionary puzzle, homology.
Homology is a pretty straightforward concept if two species have similar structures. Like the bones in a bat's wing and a human hand, it suggests they share a common ancestor. Darwin saw this as strong evidence for evolution.
Right. Similar structures, implying a shared evolutionary history. But Denton introduces a counter-argument, doesn't he?
He does. Denton argues that while similar structures might point to common ancestry, those structures often develop in vastly different ways.
Oh, how so?
For instance, the vertebrate kidney, an essential organ for filtering waste, develops through entirely different embryonic processes in different species. Even though the end result, the functional kidney, is quite similar.
So even though the end product looks similar, the underlying developmental pathways are completely different.
Exactly.
That's kind of like building a house with the same blueprint, but using different materials and construction techniques.
Exactly. Denton cites several examples of this, including the development of the amniotic egg, which allows reptiles, birds, and mammals to reproduce on land. Despite their similar function and structure, the amniotic egg develops through very different embryonic processes in each group.
So what's the takeaway here? Is Denton saying that homology is a useless concept?
Not necessarily. He's simply urging us to be cautious about assuming that similar structures always equate to a simple linear evolutionary lineage. He suggests that homology might be a more complex phenomenon than traditionally assumed.
So Denton is encouraging us to think beyond the surface similarities and delve deeper into the developmental and genetic underpinnings of those similarities. It's like realizing that two paintings might look similar from afar, but when you examine the brushstrokes and techniques, you realize they were created in completely different ways.
That's a great analogy. Denton's point is that focusing solely on the end product, the structural similarity, might mask a much more complex evolutionary history.
Okay, so we've talked about the gaps in the fossil record and the challenges to homology. What other issues does Denton raise?
Well, this is where things get really interesting, even a bit mind-boggling. Denton tackles the problem of perfection, a challenge that even Darwin himself grappled with.
Wait, what does perfection have to do with evolution? Isn't evolution all about gradual change and adaptation, not striving for some ideal form?
That's the common misconception. Even Darwin admitted that the idea of natural selection creating complex structures like the eye was hard to swallow. He famously said that the eye, to this day, gives me a cold shudder.
So Darwin himself had doubts about how random gradual changes could produce something as intricate and seemingly perfect as the human eye.
He did indeed. And Denton takes this problem to the molecular level, where the level of complexity and precision is absolutely astounding. Take protein synthesis, for example. It's like a micro-miniaturized factory operating within every single cell of your body.
Okay, break this down for me. What's so amazing about protein synthesis?
Imagine a factory with hundreds of intricate, interconnected parts, each working with incredible precision to assemble complex molecules. That's essentially what happens inside a cell during protein synthesis. It's a mind-blowingly complex process involving ribosomes, messenger RNA, transfer RNA, and a whole cast of molecular characters.
It sounds more complicated than any factory humans have ever built.
It is. And the sheer complexity of this process, Denton argues, challenges the idea that it could have arisen through a series of small, random changes. He compares it to a massive library where every book, every sentence, every letter has to be in the perfect order for the library to function. Change one letter in one book and the whole system could break down.
So he's essentially saying that the molecular world is full of these incredibly complex, finely tuned systems that seem to defy explanation by random chance alone.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. Denton points to the human brain with its trillions of connections.
Wow.
Each one precisely formed. He compares it to a vast forest covering half the United States, with each leaf representing a single neural connection.
That's an incredible image. It really highlights the mind-boggling complexity of biological systems. But I'm guessing Denton doesn't just stop at describing the complexity. He connects it back to his critique of Darwinian evolution. Right.
He does indeed. Denton argues that the sheer complexity and precision we see in the biological world, from the molecular level to the intricate structures of organs and organisms, raises serious questions about the adequacy of random mutation and natural selection as the sole driving forces of evolution.
So Denton isn't necessarily denying evolution, but he's challenging us to consider whether the traditional Darwinian explanation fully accounts for the incredible level of complexity and apparent perfection we see in nature.
Precisely, he's pushing us to think outside the box, to explore whether there might be other factors, perhaps even undiscovered laws of nature, that contribute to the origin and diversity of life.
Speaking of origins, we can't forget the ultimate enigma, the origin of life itself. This is where things get really mind-bending.
Absolutely. We know quite a bit about the conditions on early Earth, and Denton highlights some serious challenges to the classic primordial soup theory.
The primordial soup. The idea that life arose from a mix of organic molecules in some warm little pond. It's such a familiar image, but Denton seems to have some issues with it. What are his main concerns?
For starters, despite decades of searching, we haven't found any fossil evidence of these abiotically produced organic compounds, the building blocks of life that supposedly formed spontaneously in that primordial soup.
So the very foundation of the theory is missing. That's a pretty big problem.
It is indeed. And then there's the problem of oxygen and ultraviolet radiation. Both would have been abundant on early Earth and would have been extremely detrimental to those delicate early organic molecules.
So how could life possibly arise in such a harsh environment? It seems like the odds were stacked against it.
That's the question that continues to baffle scientists. Denton emphasizes the enormity of the leap from those simple organic molecules, even if they did exist, to the incredible complexity of even the simplest cell.
Right. Even a single-celled bacterium is a marvel of intricate machinery. It's not just a bag of molecules. It's a highly organized, self-replicating system.
Exactly. Even Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, admitted that the origin of life with our current knowledge seems almost a miracle.
Almost a miracle from a Nobel laureate. That's quite a statement.
It is, and it highlights the profound gap between non-life and life, a gap that remains largely unexplained by current scientific understanding.
It's fascinating how Denton connects this back to his earlier points about the gaps between species in the fossil record. It's like he's seeing this pattern of discontinuity throughout the history of life, both at the macroscopic level and at the molecular level.
You've hit the nail on the head. Denton is suggesting that the origin of life might be a fundamental discontinuity, not just a missing piece of the puzzle that we'll eventually find. It's a challenge that forces us to re-examine our assumptions about the nature of life itself.
So what does this all mean? If Darwinian evolution might not be the complete answer, what other possibilities could explain the origin and diversity of life on Earth? That's a question we'll have to explore further in part 2 of our deep dives.
Stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started with Denton's thought-provoking analysis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we're exploring Michael Denton's thought-provoking critique of Darwinian evolution. We've already uncovered some fascinating challenges, from gaps in the fossil record to the mind-boggling complexity of biological systems. But here's the thing that really struck me. Even if we accept Denton's criticisms, even if we acknowledge the limitations of the traditional Darwinian model, it's undeniable that the Darwinian paradigm still holds immense sway over scientific thought.
You're absolutely right. It's become the dominant lens through which we view the natural world, the default explanation for the diversity of life.
And that's where things get a bit tricky. Denton argues that this dominance, this almost unquestioned acceptance of the Darwinian paradigm, can create a situation where the paradigm's assumptions actually take precedence over potentially challenging data.
It's like we're wearing these Darwinian glasses that filter everything we see, making it difficult to even recognize evidence that might not fit the traditional narrative.
So it's not necessarily intentional bias, but more like an ingrained way of thinking, a subconscious filter that shapes how we interpret the world.
Exactly. And Denton expresses concern that this could hinder a more complete and unbiased understanding of nature. It's like trying to solve a puzzle while only looking for pieces that fit a predetermined picture. You might miss crucial pieces that don't fit your preconceived notion.
So how do we move beyond this ingrained paradigm? How do we approach the mysteries of evolution with fresh eyes, so to speak?
That's the million-dollar question. Denton doesn't offer any definitive answers, but he does suggest some intriguing avenues for exploration.
Okay.
He points to the possibility of undiscovered natural laws or properties of life that might influence evolution in ways we don't yet understand.
So there might be fundamental principles governing life that we haven't even discovered yet.
Absolutely. Remember how baffled people were by the idea that migrating birds could sense the Earth's magnetic field? Who knows what other mysteries are out there waiting to be uncovered?
It seems like Denton is advocating for a more humble approach to science, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that the current paradigm might not be the whole story.
Precisely, he reminds us that the origin of new beings on Earth is still largely as enigmatic as it was in Darwin's time. We've made incredible progress, but there's still so much we don't know.
Yeah.
So much that remains unexplained.
Denton doesn't just focus on the big picture of the fossil record and the origin of species.
Yeah.
He also delves deep into the molecular world, exploring the incredible complexity of cells and what that means for our understanding of evolution.
Ah, yes. This is where Denton's argument gets even more intricate. He paints this vivid picture of the cell as a microminiaturized factory, a bustling hub of activity with thousands of incredibly intricate molecular machines working in perfect harmony.
It's amazing to think that something so small, something we can't even see with the naked eye, can be so complex.
It is, and when you really start to grasp the scale of this complexity, it becomes even more mind-boggling. We're talking about proteins, these long chains of amino acids, each one folded into a precise three-dimensional shape, carrying out specific tasks within the cell.
Okay, I need a little help here. How do these proteins, these molecular machines, challenge the traditional view of evolution?
Well, imagine trying to build a complex machine, like a car engine, by randomly throwing parts together. The odds of success are pretty slim, right? Now imagine trying to build a machine far more complex than any human invention, a machine with thousands of interacting parts, each one essential for the machine to function.
It seems almost impossible, like trying to win the lottery 1,000 times in a row.
Exactly, and that's essentially Denton's point. He argues that the sheer complexity and precision of these molecular machines, these proteins, makes it incredibly difficult to imagine how they could have arisen through a series of small, random changes.
So he's saying that the molecular world, the very foundation of life, poses a serious challenge to the idea of gradual evolution through random mutation and natural selection.
That's the heart of his argument. He highlights the extreme precision required for protein function. Each protein is like a delicate lock, and its corresponding molecule is the only key that fits. Change even a single amino acid in the protein sequence, and the key might no longer work. The whole system could malfunction.
So the slightest error, the tiniest change, can have a huge impact on the entire system.
Exactly. And remember those huge gaps we talked about in the fossil record?
Yeah.
Well, Denton sees a similar pattern of discontinuity at the molecular level.
What do you mean by that? Are there missing links at the molecular level, too?
In a way, yes. Denton points out that we haven't found any evidence of a gradual evolutionary sequence among the diverse cells on Earth. Even the simplest bacteria, these tiny single-celled organisms, are incredibly complex, and they share the same basic biochemical design as more complex organisms like plants and animals.
So there's no primitive cell, no clear starting point that we can trace back to the origin of life.
Not according to Denton. He argues that molecular biology has revealed a remarkable uniformity in the basic design of cells, regardless of their complexity. It's as if all life shares a common blueprint, a fundamental design principle that's been conserved throughout evolutionary history.
That's a fascinating idea. But doesn't that contradict the traditional view of a branching evolutionary tree, where we should see a gradual progression from simple to complex?
It does indeed. And this lack of a clear ancestral lineage, Denton suggests, further challenges the traditional Darwinian narrative.
So if we're not seeing this gradual progression, the smooth continuum from simple to complex, what does that tell us about the nature of evolution?
That's a question that Denton grapples with throughout his book. He proposes that instead of a branching tree life might be better represented as a series of distinct types, each separated by significant discontinuities.
So like islands in an archipelago rather than branches on a tree. That's a pretty radical departure from the traditional view.
It is, and it raises all sorts of questions about how these distinct types arose, whether they share a common origin, and what mechanisms might have driven their diversification.
Denton doesn't just shy away from the tough questions. He tackles them head on. He even delves into the controversial topic of the origin of life, highlighting the vast and absolute chasm between living and non-living matter.
He's particularly critical of the prebiotic soup theory, arguing that there's no evidence that such a soup ever existed. And even if it did, he questions how those simple organic molecules could have spontaneously assembled into the incredibly complex machinery of a living cell.
It's fascinating how Denton consistently draws parallels between different levels of biological organization. He sees the same pattern of discontinuity, whether we're talking about species, organs, or even molecules.
You've hit the nail on the head. Denton's central argument hinges on this concept of discontinuity. He challenges the Darwinian assumption of a smooth, gradual continuum, arguing that the evidence points to a more fragmented, stepwise pattern of evolution.
So he's not saying that evolution didn't happen, but he's questioning the traditional mechanisms and the idea of a seamless evolutionary tree.
Exactly. He's proposing a more nuanced, more complex view of evolution, one that acknowledges both the continuity and the discontinuity that we see in the natural world.
This raises a question that has probably been lingering in our listeners' minds. If the Darwinian model isn't sufficient, what other possibilities might explain the origin and diversity of life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Denton doesn't offer any specific alternatives, but he opens the door for new possibilities. He encourages us to think outside the box, to consider that there might be other factors, perhaps even undiscovered laws of nature that contribute to the origin and diversity of life.
It's an invitation to think critically, to challenge our assumptions, and to remain open to new discoveries. And that's what makes Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, such a compelling read, even decades after its publication.
It's a book that sparks curiosity, that challenges our understanding of the world, and that ultimately reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is an ongoing journey full of surprises and unanswered questions.
Well said. And speaking of unanswered questions, Denton doesn't shy away from tackling the issue of chance versus design, especially when it comes to the remarkable perfection we see in nature.
This is where Denton's analysis gets really thought-provoking. He challenges us to consider whether the sheer complexity and ingenuity of biological systems can be adequately explained by random chance and natural selection alone.
He uses some really compelling examples, comparing biological systems to human-made machines to illustrate his point.
Absolutely. He points out that even our most advanced technologies pale in comparison to the intricate molecular machinery of life. The cell, he says, is like a vast automated factory, carrying out countless complex operations with astonishing efficiency.
And he doesn't stop there. He compares the human brain with its trillions of connections to a forest covering half the United States, with each leaf representing a neural connection. It's a powerful image that highlights the mind-boggling complexity of biological systems.
And it's not just the complexity that's impressive. It's also the incredible ingenuity, the elegant solutions that nature has found for problems that humans have only recently started to tackle with technology.
It's almost like nature has already figured out the answers that we're still struggling to find.
That's a great way to think about it. Denton points to examples like the eye and the camera, the articulated legs of insects, and the Lunokhod rover, highlighting how nature has developed remarkably sophisticated solutions that often anticipate human inventions.
It makes you wonder if there's some inherent intelligence or design principle at work in nature, something beyond random chance.
That's the question that many people grapple with when confronted with the sheer wonder of biological complexity, and Denton's book certainly adds fuel to that debate.
He doesn't shy away from the philosophical implications of his arguments, does he?
Not at all. He suggests that the traditional Darwinian view, which attributes everything to chance, might be too simplistic. He acknowledges that there's a sense of awe and wonder that arises when contemplating the perfection of nature, a feeling that goes beyond a purely mechanistic explanation.
So what does all this mean for our understanding of evolution? Is Denton suggesting that we should abandon Darwin altogether?
No, not necessarily. Denton is challenging us to reconsider our assumptions, to acknowledge the limitations of the traditional Darwinian model. He's urging us to explore new possibilities, to consider that there might be other factors, perhaps even undiscovered laws of nature that contribute to the origin and diversity of life.
So it's not a complete rejection of Darwin, but a call for a more nuanced, more expansive view of evolution.
Exactly. Denton's not saying throw out Darwin. He's saying, let's look deeper, let's ask tougher questions, let's be open to new ideas. And that's what makes his work so valuable, even decades after it was published. He's pushing us to keep exploring, to keep questioning, to keep searching for a deeper understanding of the mysteries of life.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's one more intriguing aspect of Denton's argument, that we need to address the concept of typology and its potential relevance to understanding evolution.
That's right. We'll delve into that fascinating topic in part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore how Denton reinterprets the classic notion of typology, in light of molecular discoveries, and what implications that might have for our understanding of the patterns of life. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of Michael Denton's Evolution, a Theory in Crisis.
And this last part.
This is where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
We're diving into the concept of typology.
It's a fascinating concept.
It might sound a bit old-fashioned, but it has surprisingly relevant implications for understanding evolution.
What's intriguing is how Denton takes this old idea, this notion that living things fall into distinct categories or types, and breathes new life into it through the lens of molecular biology.
Okay, before we get lost in the molecular weeds, can you remind me what typology even means? I vaguely remember it from my biology classes, but it always seemed like a pre-Darwinian concept.
You're right. It was a dominant idea before Darwin. Think back to that world where species were seen as fixed and unchanging, each one created in its perfect form, like separate molds or blueprints. That's the essence of typology.
Right, so the opposite of gradual evolution and the branching tree of life. But you're saying Denton brings this concept back even after Darwin revolutionized biology.
He does, and this is where things get really interesting. Denton argues that even at the molecular level, nature seems to exhibit this distinct pattern of grouping, a kind of biochemical echo of typology.
So even though we can't deny the reality of microevolution, the small-scale changes within species, there might still be these fundamental discontinuities between larger groups, these distinct types.
That's precisely what Denton suggests, and he backs up this claim with some intriguing evidence from protein analysis.
Okay, I'm all ears. How do proteins, those tiny molecular machines, support this idea of typology?
Well, scientists have been comparing the amino acid sequences of proteins found in different species, looking for clues about their evolutionary relationships. And what they've found is pretty surprising.
Lead me down the protein path. What's so surprising about these protein comparisons?
When you compare the same proteins, say a hemoglobin molecule, across a wide range of species, from bacteria to humans, you'd expect to see a gradual progression of differences in their amino acid sequences, reflecting their evolutionary history.
Right. The further apart two species are on the evolutionary tree, the more differences we should see in their proteins.
Makes sense. But here's the catch. Instead of finding this smooth, gradual progression of change, researchers have found something quite different. They've discovered that the differences between protein sequences from different species are remarkably consistent. It's as if there's a fixed distance between these groups, even over vast periods of time.
So instead of a gradual blending of protein sequences like colors smoothly transitioning on a spectrum, it's more like distinct bands of color with clear boundaries between them.
That's a fantastic way to visualize it. It's like these proteins are clustered into distinct groups, each with its own characteristic sequence, and there's a clear gap between those groups.
So it's like the protein world is also showing this pattern of discontinuity, similar to what Denton observed in the fossil record.
Exactly. And this pattern, Denton argues, doesn't fit neatly with the traditional Darwinian model, which would predict a more gradual blended pattern of change.
It's like nature is playing by a different set of rules than we initially thought. If mutations are random, why would they create this consistent distance between protein types?
That's the puzzle that Denton is trying to solve. He argues that neither genetic drift, the random fluctuations in gene frequencies, nor positive selection, the favoring of beneficial mutations, can fully account for this remarkable uniformity in protein differences between major groups.
So it's like there are invisible barriers preventing those gradual transitions between major protein types, keeping those distinct groups separate.
That's a great way to think about it. And this molecular evidence, Denton argues, resonates with the other patterns we've discussed. The distinct types in the fossil record, the challenges to homology, the difficulty of explaining complex structures through purely random processes.
It all seems to point back to this idea that nature might be inherently discontinuous, challenging the central dogma of a seamless evolutionary continuum. It's like we're starting to see cracks in that smooth branching tree of life and glimpsing something more intricate, more mosaic-like beneath the surface.
You've captured it perfectly. Denton is suggesting that the true pattern of life might be more complex, more multifaceted than we previously imagined.
But if the traditional model isn't telling the whole story, where do we go from here? What other possibilities might explain this intriguing pattern of discontinuity?
That's the big question that Denton's book leaves us with. He doesn't offer any definitive answers, but he opens the door for new ways of thinking about evolution. Maybe there are undiscovered laws of nature that govern the formation of these distinct types. Or perhaps life itself possesses some inherent property, some self-organizing principle that we haven't yet grasped.
It's both humbling and exciting to think that there's still so much we don't know about the fundamental nature of life and the processes that have shaped its diversity.
Yeah.
Denton's book doesn't give us all the answers, but it certainly inspires a sense of awe and wonder about the mysteries of the natural world.
It reminds us that science is an ongoing journey of discovery, a process of constantly refining our understanding as we encounter new evidence and grapple with new questions.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Michael Denton's Evolution, a theory in crisis. We've covered a lot of ground exploring Denton's challenges to Darwinian macroevolution, the incredible complexity of biological systems, and the lingering enigma of life's origins.
We started by looking at the historical context.
Yeah, the world before Darwin.
And then delved into the core principles of Darwinian evolution.
And then we really got into Denton's critiques.
We talked about the fossil record,
The gaps, the missing links,
the challenges to homology,
the problem of perfection,
the mind-boggling complexity of the molecular world.
and the ultimate mystery, the origin of life itself.
In this last part, we've explored the concept of typology and how Denton reinterprets it through the lens of modern science.
It's fascinating how he brings together evidence from so many different areas to challenge the traditional view of evolution.
He's not afraid to ask the tough questions to push the boundaries of our understanding.
We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity,
Yeah.
challenged your assumptions, and perhaps even inspired you to explore Denton's book for yourself.
Remember, the pursuit of knowledge is an ongoing adventure, and as Denton reminds us, the origin of new beings on Earth is still largely as enigmatic as it was when Darwin set sail on the Beagle.
The journey of discovery continues.